Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the October Housing Our Future webinar. We're really happy to have you with us today. This is a very timely topic, talking about federal and state of Ohio housing policy updates. My name is Kristen Baker. I'm the Executive Director of LISC Greater Cincinnati, and we're happy to share this information with you today. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website in a week or so after the event. We're also happy to take your questions, so please use the chat function to send questions to the panel. We're going to do our best to get to as many of those as we can today. I know that many of you probably have a lot of pressing questions. Hopefully the presentations, I think, will cover a lot of that, but we're happy to hear from you, so please use that chat function. And you will be muted for the presentation, so we will only be accepting questions through the chat. So again, really happy to have so many folks here to talk about this important issue and the moment of the day. We know that there's probably a lot of questions, especially given the current federal shutdown. So we're going to definitely touch on that and the landscape more broadly, in addition to the tactical policy agenda items that we know are moving or not moving through the various levels of local and federal and state government. So I'm going to we're going to start first with the state of Ohio. So Nathan Meinert is with Momentum Strategy Group. Nathan is a consultant that LISC has been working with for the last 2 years on state policy and is really an expert in what's happening in Columbus around housing. And so Nathan's going to step us through what's happening in Columbus right now and what we should all keep our eye on. And I will pass it off to you, Nathan.
All right. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks to everybody for being here. I'm Nathan Meinert with Momentum Strategy Group. As Kristen said, I work on with LISC on housing policy and work with other groups to move policy and legislation in the state of Ohio. So housing is having its moment. At this point, there really isn't a legislator or a policymaker in Ohio that hasn't heard about the need to develop and preserve housing across the state. There are challenges across the state, even though those look different in many areas. So whether at home or in their in their districts or in Columbus, legislators really can't escape the housing conversation. So they know they need to address it, but many are not sure the right course of action or focused on local aspects. There are very few housing experts in the Ohio General Assembly at this point. So although they've been taking steps really over the last 2.5 years to positively move the needle on housing, they've done quite a few things, and many of those, several of those in this last budget. So many of you are familiar with the Home Matters to Ohio policy platform. LISC and a few other groups developed that to give legislators a framework for how to approach the housing challenges in our state, to help really educate legislators and other policymakers, to give them a basic level understanding of where we should go and how we should get there. So the coalition is continuing to build on that work, educating at the State House and pushing those policies today. Next slide, please. So housing production. This last budget had a variety of things that touched housing, although I wouldn't categorize that there were any new major housing investments this cycle, but there were tools preserved, and we got a few new programs that could have an impact if they're scaled up at a higher level. One theme has emerged as the Ohio General Assembly and legislators look at solutions for housing across the state, and that's their preference is to empower local governments. They see this as a uniquely local problem, even though it's pervasive across the state. And so their preference is to empower locals with tools and programs to let them figure it out. In addition to that, the budget also avoided some structural changes that could have been catastrophic for housing development in our state, specifically a program or budget provision that would have eliminated OFA and affected tax credits, housing tax credits in this state. Next slide, please. So in terms of housing production, a couple new programs, RED, the Residential Economic Development Districts. This is a great concept designed to provide a carrot approach to local governments and municipalities who are willing to put some skin in the game and take action to address local barriers that might affect housing development. So whether that's reducing permitting times, changing zoning positively, developing infrastructure, and other actions, local governments can unlock state funding by moving the needle locally on things that are barriers to housing. And those grants then will support housing infrastructure. However, with that program, the amount appropriated really makes it a pilot in reality. So what we're hoping is in the next few years, local governments, and maybe there's local government folks on here, or you work with local governments, we can help a few local governments who are going to be able to take advantage of that program, prove the efficacy of the funding, and help position it for an increase in the next state budget that's 2 years away. Another new program that came into play in the budget, the RDRLP, the Residential Development Revolving Loan Program. We love our acronyms in this industry. It's a revolving loan program that will help rural local governments specifically address housing infrastructure through very low interest loans. Many of you may be familiar with the Welcome Home Ohio program, with which the legislature created in the last budget. That program was modified in this budget to facilitate more projects across the state around single-family home ownership. That includes increasing the grant size and expanding the eligibility of the potential home buyer. So we look forward to those changes positively taking effect next year and hopefully increasing single-family housing production across the state. And many of you have heard about LIHTC, the state housing tax credit, which is designed to couple with federal tax credits and build more housing across the state, multifamily and single family through lease purchase. So LIHTC was kept status quo in this last budget, which is great. That's certainly a win in and of itself when this was a pretty austere budget for a lot of special interests. However, that program is grossly overprescribed at $100 million a year and sunsets in 2027. So the work of the housing industry over the next couple of years is going to be to increase that program really to about $300 million, because it's currently overprescribed 3 to 1, and then making it a permanent program in the state budget. Next slide, please. Along the lines of housing preservation, there were a few moves in this last budget that could have negatively affected the ability to rehab and preserve units across the state. On the historic tax credit. Sorry, I can't talk today. The historic tax credit was ultimately saved despite it being in danger during the budget process. So it was on the chopping block. I know many developers and many communities across the state use that historic tax credit to bring new vibrancy to their downtowns and use that as a catalyst for housing and economic development. So luckily, that was saved in the budget and is still intact. As stated previously, LIHTC, the state tax credit, can also be used for rehab and preservation projects, and that was retained. And then the Ohio Housing Trust Fund, which is really the state's multi-use fund for housing purposes that range from homelessness to senior home repair to gap funding for LIHTC projects, was preserved, but not without some battles. For the millionth time, it seems like the housing industry and other advocates had to come in and help save that funding from obliteration in this budget. Following the trend of the General Assembly to empower local governments to deal with housing, there was a late stage proposal that would have taken the funding mechanism for the trust fund, recordation fees, and retained those in the counties to keep and utilize for housing-related purposes locally. Although that doesn't sound like a bad plan, it would have significantly shaken the status quo and dismantled many of the programs already that are rolled up at the state level there. So, trust fund revenues are at an all-time low. They threaten the viability of the program even going into this last budget. So I know advocates are actively seeking solutions to find new revenue sources for the trust fund, so it can continue to be like a Swiss Army knife for state housing programs. And a key part of whatever those solutions are is addressing giving local governments some more control of how those dollars are spent. Next slide, please. Tenant and homeowner protections. There wasn't a whole lot of movement in the budget, pretty much a net neutral. So tenant protections still remain primarily local. We do in our Home Matters to Ohio policy platform, and we have some provisions that we recommend around eviction prevention and right to counsel. We know some of our coalition members are actively working, and will be working over the next 14 months to try to get some of those things into law, and or build up for a larger budget push where those things are included in 2 years. There were some vetoes around homeless shelter funding and some restrictive provisions that the governor issued, which are not in jeopardy of being overridden. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of factors shaping housing policy, both this past budget cycle and into the future, leading up into a next budget cycle. The Ohio General Assembly has made their intention clear to continue to lower taxes, really across the board. So beginning in 2026, all Ohioans earning more than $26,000 and change will be taxed at a flat rate of 2.75%, which will replace the state's current tiered personal income tax system. So this has been pushed by both the House and Senate majorities, as well as the business community. So while this move simplifies compliance and is seen as pro-growth, pro-business growth, it will take money off the table. It's projected to reduce revenue to the state by over $1 billion over the next 2 years. So, again, taking it off the table for future programs and for housing. You've got some infrastructure investments, but housing wasn't necessarily included in those outside of the programs that I mentioned a few slides back. Cleveland's getting a new stadium. That was about $600 million. And, I know a lot of the housing industry and advocates think, of the things we could do with even a fraction of that. So we've still got work to do, I think, at the State House to convince legislators that housing is critical infrastructure. Data center tax incentives remain. Those were a little controversial. There was some talk about pulling those out, but they're going to be there, which again takes future revenue off the table for potentially for housing programs. And we have to expect that this ongoing saga that I'm sure many of you are familiar with around OFA independence could remain into the next couple of years. There's a new administration at OFA, a new senior team. They're certainly making some moves to be more impactful than OFA has been in the past, and to address housing issues across the state. But again, this could continue to be a problem into the next budget. In the last few years, we've had to play defense so many times and use so much significant political capital to keep OFA independent. It has taken away from advocacy on other housing programs and funding. So, we got to continue to keep OFA independent so it's depoliticized and investors can maintain confidence in the tax credits. Next slide, please. And the big elephant in the room, property tax reform and relief. I'm not going to go deep into this because this could warrant a whole webinar series on its own, and it certainly requires someone much more knowledgeable in property taxes than myself. But what you need to know is this: if an effort to get an issue on the ballot to completely eliminate property taxes in Ohio makes it to the ballot, if they get the signatures, 443,000, it will pass. And that will create a funding a conundrum for every local government and as well as state government across the state. So this is lighting a fire under legislators. They now know they have to deliver on property tax relief in some fashion. There were a few provisions in the budget that both the House and Senate were in favor of. So they made it through the final version of the budget, but the governor vetoed them. The General Assembly has overridden one of those vetoes, and the House of Representatives just last week passed two bills and sent two bills over to the Senate that mirror the other vetoed provisions. So it does not look like there'll be a veto override on those other two issues. However, they've passed bills and they have incorporated recommendations from the governor's task force in those bills, hopefully to mitigate the governor's concerns and other concerns. So they're going to continue to pass some property tax bills. Some of this is wild speculation about what those are going to be. It's hard to imagine they get anywhere near comprehensive property tax reform and relief, as it would take so many stakeholders, really hundreds and thousands, around a table to agree on what that looks like, and they'd have to unravel the whole thing. So as you can imagine, I'm not sure there's the political appetite for that. But they're going to pass bills, and they're going to pass them before Thanksgiving. And that's unfolding pretty quickly in real time with hearings even this week on legislation. There's somewhere around over 120 or 127 property tax related bills sitting over at the State House right now. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of noise in this space and a lot of different opinions on which way to go. So that being said, they're going to pass bills, but I would expect that their work on this is going to extend through next year as they're trying to head off this ballot initiative that, again, could be disastrous for local government, schools, public safety, and other essential services that we all know and rely on. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, housing is having its moment. Housing is in the game right now. There is a demand for solutions, and I really hope that all of you, if you haven't, are talking to your state members of the House and members of the Senate about your viewpoint and how solutions you may see locally to some of these problems related to housing. You need to clearly communicate the need, the problems, and the solutions. If you all aren't doing it, if we're not doing it, no one else is going to do it for us. So, build those relationships, reach out, let them know what you're thinking on housing. Certainly look at the Home Matters to Ohio policy platform as a guide if you want. And there's other, there's folks like me, LISC, and others who can help you craft those messages. Local governments increasingly in the driver's seat of these solutions. So it's also incumbent that, you build relationships there as well. Counties, municipalities, they're going to be looking for advice, expertise, and solutions. They're going to want to be looking at how these tools are applicable in their cities and villages. And so the more you all can dig in and help them understand how these things could be successful, the more money we're going to be able to leverage ultimately based on that success. The next 14 months really is about education, education, education. Again, of the General Assembly, local officials, and other stakeholders. And then keep an eye out for property tax bills, because they're moving. They're going to continue to move. Sometimes these things are moving fast and there's very little time to weigh in. So I would encourage everybody to just have situational awareness on that and understand how these provisions affect you, your work, and your local governments. So thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Nathan. Lots to think about here, and I think we'll have some follow-up questions when we move to Q&A. So I appreciate your presentation. And now I'm going to turn to my colleague and friend, Mark Kudlowitz, who's our Senior Director of Federal Policy with LISC in Washington, D.C. And Mark is going to step us through what's happening at the federal level. And again, more questions, please include them in the chat so we can get to those when Mark's presentation concludes. Mark?
Great. Thanks, Kristen, and thanks, Ohio team, for the opportunity to present today. I know we've got around 20 minutes, and I think a lot of the importance of this conversation, especially at the federal level, will be in conversation with you all locally. So I'll try to go relatively quick so we have time to chat and to take questions for Nathan's presentation too. So LISC has a policy team here in DC where we go to bat for federal affordable housing and community development programs, and I get to go to lead our affordable housing work and our work as our CDFI policy priorities. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on at the executive branch. There's a lot every week here. What's happening in Congress and the outlook. So next slide, please. So our policy team, again, we really want to be a resource for both our 37 local offices and rural LISC team, but also for our community-based partners. We do a lot of work on regulatory issues with federal award programs. So please see us as folks who can always hopefully help you if you're having an issue. And if you're in DC, we'd always love to chat. We have lots of advocacy materials and can help prep you for any visit with Congress or administration officials. Next slide. Really quickly, our policy priorities are available online. That's kind of challenges the word priorities since we have quite a few under our programmatic lanes of housing, capacity building, economic development. But it really reflects the scope of the work we're doing in partnership with community-based organizations who are very holistic in their activities working for underserved people or underserved communities. Got a special call-out document for proposals we think that would be most impactful in rural areas. And we develop these in kind of true community development style. It's very bottom up. We survey our local offices and our rural team to tell us at the federal level what's most important for their work locally. And then we present that to our leadership, and that becomes our guidepost for the next couple of years. Next slide. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk a little bit about the executive branch, and this is where we're seeing obviously a huge change here in DC with the power and essentially somewhat inverting from Congress in the moment to the executive branch, the administration. We've seen a lot happen since January, and I'm sure some of you have felt this acutely as well. The one I wanted to start with, which is intentional and I think may have some of the longest lasting impact, is the continued reduction in the civil career workforce for the federal agencies. For folks that do business with the USDA Rural Development, HUD, CDFI funded Treasury, we've never had a very, I would argue, robust staffing at these agencies, but we're seeing massive loss in staff. So to date, with only now one reduction in force or a mass layoff occurring last Friday at HUD, we'd seen around a 30% reduction in HUD career staff from folks taking voluntary separation programs or early retirements. We're already seeing the impacts of this before we talk about the shutdown. There's a lot of folks at the kind of senior career level who have quit. These are the folks that process the most complicated transactions, that write notices, that typically are in the regulatory process. So we're seeing a huge brain drain occurring. We're also seeing still a lot of funding issues where the executive branch is not paying out on obligated grants, loans, or contracts, often leading to litigation and further delaying payments. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but we're also seeing a delay in new funding notices. Obviously, that's exacerbated in this moment where we have a federal government shutdown. A lot of this is driven by the administration's executive orders, and I think most notably the DEI executive order, which is an undefined term, one related to nonprofit organizations and one related essentially to clean energy, really guiding the agencies often to refuse to disperse awarded programs, trying to chill private sector investment for things the administration does not support, and sometimes carrying a little bit of a a stick in terms of saying that you could potentially have issues with receiving federal funding in the future. For folks who didn't see it, another one I want to make sure I flag during my limited time is that some weeks back, and it's a bit hard to keep up with a lot going on here in DC, but there was an unprecedented executive order released on federal grant making. Typically in the federal space, the career staff manage the entire process when they draft a funding notice to reviewing it based on the merit-based criteria listed in that NOFO to then making awards. The only time where a political staff or an agency gets a bite is in the beginning when they're clearing a funding notice, and they may say, well, these are our policy priorities, so we want to see extra points awarded for this or that. But the actual making of an award has always been depoliticized. It doesn't go to political staff or consultation. That's what this executive order does. It says that each agency will now have a designated political staffer who are going to review the award list from the career staff before they're finalized. So it becomes a little more of an advisory role for the career staff than a final determination on award selection. And it says that this staffer as well is supposed to ensure both at the time of award and over the compliance period that the recipient of the funding is essentially in line with the administration's priority. So this really politicizes federal grant making, and we haven't seen yet this play out in practice, I would say. I think the agencies are still getting their ducks in a row and they're in a shutdown, but this will be a big change in how the federal government awards funding going forward. Next slide. Okay, what are we seeing and what do we expect? As we talked about, we're still seeing cancellations of contracts, and I'll get into this in a little more detail on one specific to our sector. We're also seeing, and I mentioned this, a bit of a play for an inversion of power in DC from Congress to the executive branch. Folks who follow the media will see that there was, for the first time in a very long time, there was a rescission package that passed Congress. And that was for PBS, NPR, and global health aid, primarily through the State Department. There is a law from 1974 called the Impoundment Act that guides how, if the executive branch wants to rescind appropriated funding, how it should work. And it's pretty simple. Essentially, they submit a package of what they want to rescind. It has 45 legislative days. And if both, on a simple majority, both houses of Congress and the president signed it, you can rescind previously appropriated spending. And that's what they did with NPR, PBS, and global health aid. The administration is not totally satisfied with that. They also want to challenge the underlying statute. This was passed during Richard Nixon, in part because they were withholding public housing funding and other appropriated dollars at the time. Director Vaught for the Office of Management and Budget has made clear, and they've already done this, where they're using what's called a pocket rescission and testing this out with the courts to see if they submit a package less than 45 legislative days before the end of the session, whether those cuts can just go into a place, which is essentially a line item veto for the executive branch. So this has not yet been fully litigated. This will go all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is a very pivotal case to watch for our sector, because what it would mean in practice is that if the president's budget could essentially become law. Right now, it's a budget recommendation to Congress to kickstart the appropriations process, but it would very much shift the power for spending from the Congress to the executive branch. And this is one of the reasons right now we have a prolonged government shutdown. It takes a bipartisan spending bill, 7 Democrats in the Senate, to get a spending bill over the finish line. But if you can rescind it on a partisan basis with a simple majority, that kind of poisons the well on why the Democrats would be expected to negotiate with Republicans. And so we'll talk about a little bit more about that. On the regulatory side, not as much as we've seen lately. We are keeping a close eye on the Community Reinvestment Act, our most important regulation for the housing and community development sector, really the oxygen for the field. There was another executive order that said the banking regulators now need to submit banking regs through the Office of Management and Budget. This is also, in my opinion, unfortunately, a potential way to politicize banking regulations, which historically were just cleared internally amongst the 3 independent banking regulators, the OCC, the Fed, and the FDIC. So right now we're at the 95 rule with CRA, and that's not a bad place to be. And I think any future attempt during this administration to reopen the rule carries a variety of risks, since it would have to be cleared by the White House. We're also monitoring what's going on with the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, our government-sponsored enterprises. The administration has made clear that they would like to do a limited IPO to test the market capitalization value for the GSEs. They still are under conservatorship and are regulated by the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And so even if they were eventually released from conservatorship, it would not abscond them of their statutory responsibilities for affordable housing, most notably the affordable housing goals, duty to serve. And we've seen, though, on a regulatory basis, some weakening of those regs. We just saw that recently with the affordable housing goals, an off-cycle proposed rule from FHFA to lower some of the purchase volume activity requirements for the GSEs for low to moderate income people. Next slide. All right, that's a lot with the administration. Let's keep going. Next slide. What's going on in Congress? All right, we talked about this a little bit. We've been in a shutdown for 3 weeks now, almost, or no, excuse me, a little over 2 weeks. No end in sight, no real negotiations happening between the party. As I mentioned, the well is somewhat poisoned on the spending process right now because of the way the administration has treated congressionally appropriated funding. And I wanted to kind of frame this a little bit in the the materials I was sent by Kristen and team around your goals around production, preservation, protection. So on the production side, right now there is a threat to production. If you have an FHA multifamily insured loan and you had a firm commitment, that's probably going through. Some of the staff are called essential or non-essential. Most are non-essential, which means essentially they're not working, they're at home. Essential staff are working, but are not getting paid until the government reopens. So if you had a firm commitment on an FHA insured multifamily loan, that's probably going through. You wanted to submit a new one, it's stuck, right? So that's threatening both production and preservation deals. The preservation capacity for HUD and USDA are very limited right now, like on a HAP contract renewal or for USDA for their 521 program. That's a risk if this goes on for a long time. We also have protection issues, right? So if we lapse funding over time, it will threaten the viability of the properties and the tenants. Right now, we have enough rollover dollars from fiscal year 25 to 26 for the agencies to keep making payments on tenant-based and project-based rental assistance contracts. If the shutdown, though, continues for a prolonged period, that will not be the case. They will run out of money based on the account, like a PRAC contract for 202 or 811 housing, eventually PBRA contracts, tenant-based contracts as well. And that's where we run into a very, very big problem. Next slide. Okay, so we didn't get very far this session because of some of the growing ill will between parties. The House only passed a few spending bills out of the 12, Senate hardly did any. These are some numbers, their best effort, which didn't get too far. As you can see, and to be expected, the House is lower than the Senate, right? In the House, you can pass things on a simple majority on a partisan basis. You can't do that in the Senate. So, and I want to point out, for the first time that I can ever remember, the HOME program, our nation's only block grant for affordable housing, was zeroed out in the House. I don't think that's going to happen in practice. The Senate put it back to where it was in 25, but it does show the kind of austerity of the cuts that the House Republicans are entertaining. We do have some modest success on the Section 4 program, flat funding it in this environment in the House is a win, and you can see a nice expansion in the Senate. The administration did propose a proposal to block grant, which all tenant-based and project-based rental assistance programs to the states. The Republicans did not support this in the House or the Senate, and that has not moved forward. We'll talk a little bit more about the CDFI fund, which is under another threat, probably for the 4th or 5th time this year. And on the USDA rural housing side, generally flat numbers, although mostly on the House side, some small reductions. Next slide. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about, so okay, that's all big picture macro stuff, right? But like actually what's up with the programs that you all rely on and that the field really uses for production or preservation or protection? Okay, no surprise, the Inflation Reduction Act, the climate bill, that's essentially mostly been repealed. There's some tax credits that are in existence around buildings that will expire at the end of this year, which is why you see a continued push for solar installation. But the programs specific to our sector, like the Green Resilient Retrofit Program at HUD for HUD-assisted properties, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund programs, those were all repealed, rescinded, and many of which are currently in litigation. So those are not going to be resources we can use for recapitalization or to make properties more resilient for the most part. The fair housing programs have been explicitly targeted during this administration, the small fair housing grant programs to local fair housing organizations. Those are also currently in litigation. I do want to point out one that LISC has been trying to work in partnership here with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and enterprise community partners around the HUD's Continuum of Care program. Very briefly, the administration is going away from a decades-long approach, from a housing first approach for federal homelessness policy. What this is going to mean in practice is right now, even if they could put a funding notice out, which they can't, for the next funding round for local continuums of care, we're going to see money start to lapse in January. Even if I could get the NOFO out, they wouldn't be able to process it and make awards by January. But public reporting has also indicated, contrary to the underlying law for the Continuum of Care program, that HUD plans to cap renewal dollars at 30% for supportive housing developments. This is a very, very big deal. 87% of the Continuum of Care dollars are used for renewal costs at supportive housing properties. It's essentially paying the operating costs like a rental assistance contract. So if you cap this at 30% artificially and contrary to the McKinney-Vento Act, which says essentially that you have to renew for existing developments, you could formally see these properties go under over time because they would lose the operating assistance for those units, and it would also threaten the viability of the sponsors that develop them. It's also estimated that over 170,000 formerly chronically homeless individuals, most of whom has disabilities, would most likely be made homeless unless local or state dollars could come in. The administration is not as supportive of a permanent supportive housing. They want to see much more term limited assistance, including for supportive housing developments. I'd be remiss as well if I didn't mention the CDFI fund. On Friday, the entire staff at the CDFI fund, only around 80 folks, received a reduction in force, a mass layoff. There was also previous concerns from the administration over CDFI's racial equity and climate activities in the financing space. Right now, there's been some good headwinds good momentum here, where very senior Senate Republicans have publicly leaned in on this and said that this is not acceptable, including Senator Crapo, who leads the tax committee for the Republicans in the Senate, Senator Rounds from South Dakota, and others. CDFIs are very bipartisan on the Hill, but are unfortunately very politicized in this moment with the administration. The Opportunity Finance Network, the trade association for mostly nonprofit CDFIs, does have some advocacy materials on their website where folks can lean in with Republican members. And I would say for you all, Senator Marino is on the banking committee. Your freshman senator from Ohio, which does have purview over the CDFI fund. So he'd be a great person for you all to ping if you're willing and have interest. Next slide. Okay, very briefly, and I know I got a couple minutes here before questions. A big tax bill went through. This is a bit of old news, but just wanted to quickly make sure folks saw. We had the largest expansion of the low-income housing tax credit in decades, restoring the 9% formula, and I think more importantly, lowering the private activity bond threshold for bond cap states, or sort of doesn't have to be bond cap states, but it gives more breathing room for 4% deals. This is a huge win. Unfortunately, there are some things in here that are not as good from the anti-poverty perspective, including a future reduction in cost shifting on the Medicaid program, which will challenge state budgets over the next couple of years, and a reduction in food assistance benefits. This will certainly have an impact on tenants and low-income families. Next slide. Briefly, the new markets tax credit was also made permanent. Ironically, the CDFI fund staff are the ones that administer that credit. We're about to make an award before there was a mass layoff. Showing you the disconnect between the Republican leadership that passed this partisan tax bill and what's going on at the agencies. That was a $10 billion round. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act was not included. This is our highest affordable homeownership tax credit priority for owner-occupied housing, where the cost to build or rehab exceeds the value in economically distressed communities, many of which are in Ohio and other states. And the OZ incentive was made permanent, including some changes. Unfortunately, the Hill, in our opinion, didn't bite on a legislative proposal we had to make it more useful and twinning it with housing credit transactions, since you don't see a lot of OZ financing activity for rent-restricted housing. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to keep this to a minute. At the same time, we have all these challenges with the Congress, with the shutdown, with the agencies, and this mixed tax bill for the sector. We have the largest non-tax credit housing legislation unanimously passing the House or the Senate Banking Committee, and then now most recently getting amended to the defense bill in 17 years since the financial crisis, since 2008. These are some provisions that LISC has done a lot of work on, modernizing USDA's rural housing service programs, primarily from a preservation perspective, reauthorizing the home program, a new home repair program, giving the RAD program permanency, formally authorizing our long-term disaster recovery program, CDBG-DR, increasing the amount of investments banks can make for LIHTC properties, and streamlining environmental reviews. The House Financial Services Committee, the equivalent in the Senate to the Banking Committee, was going to have a hearing next week, but because of the shutdown, that has been delayed. The path through the House is more uncertain, but happy to talk about that a little more maybe during the question and answers. Next slide. Okay, this is, I think, the last one. So here's kind of, in my opinion, the outlook. On the production side, got this huge LIHTC expansion, and that's a huge win. But we're having issues on the appropriated side, on the spending side, where we're seeing disruptions potentially for rental assistance, right? These are the dollars for especially ELI developments that are so important to housing credit developments, which could potentially threaten tenant stability. On the preservation side, we see the lowering of the bond threshold. That's going to be great, especially for bond-capped states. But again, the appropriation side, where we're commingling appropriated sources from the federal government, are more at risk. On the protection side, we see the risks are getting much larger. This is not an administration primarily concerned with tenant protections at all. And I would say that the withholding of the fair housing funding and the threats to our nation's most important federal homelessness program is a huge risk from a protection standpoint. HUD has also made clear they want to issue a new rule to essentially bar households that have a non-citizen member from receiving federal housing assistance, contrary to the way that works right now, where it's prorated. They also want to get a proposed rule out for both public housing and privately owned housing that tries to impose new time limits and work requirements on HUD-assisted residents. And so I think, the opportunity here, and I'll kind of end it on this, is that this is a moment to advocate. If you are working in this sector and there's a federal program important to your work, these are not normal times. You need to basically, in my opinion, really work with your trusted national advocacy partner here in DC. That doesn't have to be a LISC. It could be another organization that represents a program or programs that you would utilize locally. But this is definitely an all-hands moment where we need folks to be able to chime in with a hill, because that's the most impactful from an advocacy perspective. So I appreciate the time today. I'll kick it back to Kristen.
Thank you, Mark. All right, we're going to bring Nathan back in too, and we're going to take a few minutes to ask a few questions of panel. So there you are. Hi, Nathan. Certainly feels unprecedented. Even just, I hear this, we keep up with this at LISC, and even hearing you go through things, Mark, it definitely feels like the advocacy, as you mentioned, having folks really spend some time of making sure we're reaching out to our elected officials to help them understand exactly how these tools, these functions, the role the administration plays in our local communities and in supporting our growth and sustaining our residents' housing is really important right now. So I wonder if, it feels a little challenging to ask this question perhaps, but I wonder where we do see some opportunities for alignment, perhaps especially between federal, state, and and Nathan touched on this too, that local is really an important part of these policy priorities. So Nathan, do you want to start? I will give Mark a break from talking for a second. Do you want to talk about where you see any opportunities or the greatest opportunities for alignment around this from all levels of government?
Yeah, look, I think there's alignment around the need, right? And so that's the starting point. However, these tools are so different from the federal to state to local, right? So I think one, I think it's helping local governments understand how to utilize these tools in their local jurisdictions, right? To maximum effect, maximum unit production or preservation. I also think that look, how the housing problems are different depending on where you are geography wise, right? So I think there's a lot of associations at the state level that are working on this, but there is often a disconnect at the local level. So I think encouraging local governments, elected officials, local economic development and community development folks to chime in, reach out, seek expertise from LISC and others, I think is critical to helping them figure this out.
Mark, anything you would add on that?
Yeah, I would just add, the programs in the federal government that flow through the states, I would really bifurcate in your mind two things. The tax credit side, right, where it's going to the Housing Finance Agency, those are sit in a real special place in DC and are much more politically protected for a variety of reasons. It's really the spending side, right, where you're getting a grant, let's say from CDBG or Home, that's flowing through the state if you're in a rural community or if you're in a city or an urban county to that municipality. Look, if those are dollars important to your preservation, production work, we can't take anything for granted anymore, right? I think in the past, you get an update from someone in DC and say, okay, there's a little bit of histrionics, but we've seen this play before and it's going to work out. That should not be assumed anymore. It may not work out. And I don't say that to be engaged in histrionics, but to say the kind of reality of where we are. But onto your point though, it's like those are programs that are just evolving by formula. But don't take it for granted. Make sure you chime in. There's a lot of LISC works in partnership. There are a lot of good groups that just go to bat for the Home program, for CDBG. And so again, if you're one of those, or say you're a CAP agency and you get community service block grant dollars by formula, make sure you work with your trusted advocacy partner. They're the ones here in DC really trying to make sure that that's in a protected place.
Great. Thank you both. So Mark, if I'm hearing you correctly, we had a couple questions about sort of the status of LIHTC transactions and credits, right? As they, deals that have been awarded but haven't gotten to closing yet. This is an interplay, obviously, between federal and the state housing finance agency, but it seems like we shouldn't necessarily panic that LIHTC awards that have been made but haven't closed yet, right? Nathan, I see you nodding. Like we feel still fairly confident that at least that portion will close. But the question really then is if those are using federal sources as gap funding, right? If we're using CDBG Home, other sources, PBRA, all of those things, that maybe that's where we need to be a little concerned.
Yeah, and even I would add diminished state housing trust fund to that, right? So the real reality is it's just there's going to be less projects.
Yeah, and I think really specifically right now to this moment in the shutdown. Look, if you've got a project and it's just debt and some credits, no worries. If it had an FHA multifamily insured loan, you may have some loan closing issues on that because the FHA staff were pretty much furloughed if you don't have that firm commitment. Home CDBG right now, folks have their allocations. They can make draws, the states, the municipalities. That's more perspective. If it's a GSE loan, you're fine. But to Nathan's point, I mean, these headwinds, if we see disruptions prospectively as the new credit rules go into effect for placement service next year, then you could see challenges, right? Folks would then say, well, okay, that money's not there. Where else am I going to go? That would challenge a preservation or a new construction deal.
Great, thank you. I hope that answered the question that came from our audience. Looking through the questions here, Nathan, we had a couple of questions about at the state level about the role of investors, REITs, and others, right, in the housing market, and if there's any conversation. And I know we have talked about this a lot at the state level. Can you sort of give folks a flavor for where sort of the political winds stand right now with respect to addressing the role of out-of-state or unscrupulous investors, right, in our housing markets locally, and where the state might be, or where leadership might be on some of
Yes. Look, there's a growing awareness that this is an issue, right? Up until this point, I think it's been anecdotal, but now you're starting to see. I think the Fed released the Cleveland Fed released a study a couple weeks ago that showed a significant amount of single-family homes are being, bought by institutional investors. So I think the growing awareness and now a body of research coming to back that up is going to create some sort of impetus to do something about it, because again, it's taking supply off the table for working Ohio families and seniors and others, first time home buyers. And so there will be impetus to do something. However, I think this is where the business community and the housing industry could be a little bit at odds, right? So it remains to be seen how that's going to play out. Not sure the legislature yet understands that this is real, although again, they will as research backs it up. I could see baby steps to try to get to this, right? Trying to ice and not completely eliminating institutional investors in the mix. I don't think they could do that. I mean, that would be widely litigated, but baby steps to get there. Transparency over who's buying properties. Taking action to eliminate the bad actors in the process or mitigate the damage of bad actors is probably what we'll see first. But I do think we're probably a ways off from legislation on that.
Great, thank you. Mark, we did have a somewhat detailed question in the chat about limiting PSH at 30% or limiting permanent housing, which includes rapid rehousing at 30%. Do you track on that question? And would you have any more detail on that? That's from our COC leader. So
yeah, I need to look back. I saw that. I believe the 30% cap also includes rapid rehousing. Obviously, those are not always people with disabilities, like in supportive housing developments. But I will follow up with you on that just to make sure.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Another question for Nathan. Thinking about the proposed property tax referendum. We had a question regarding how you landed on that assessment that it would potentially pass, and what might counties and local governments do to replace that revenue should that come to fruition.
Yeah, look, there is quite a bit of polling. Well, quite a bit maybe is not the right word, but there have been polls on this at this point. And generally, it appears that Ohio voters are inclined to eliminate taxes if given the opportunity. So, there is, again, a running assumption based on some polls that this will pass if it makes that threshold of the ballot. The General Assembly is under the impression that they can work with those driving that ballot initiative if they can, show progress toward chipping away at property tax reform. Then maybe that ballot initiative, they stand down from that. And so that's sort of the running theory, is they're going to show some progress toward the issue, give some relief in pockets, particularly of the highest need, and that could make the ballot initiative go away. But again, a lot of question marks right now. What would local government do? I think everybody's racking their brain to. I mean, it just seems apocalyptic, right? I think people can't get past that visual to understand practically how we would work through a situation like that. In all those situations, there's a lot of state funding that would have to be dumped into services across the state pretty quickly.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Mark, might be, if in the worst case scenario, if the COC funds for existing permanent supportive housing projects is eliminated or reduced significantly, do you see a future where those units that are still within their LIHTC compliance period are converted to traditional rental properties, or do we have a sense of what's the other side of the coin if that sort of action takes place?
Yeah, so it would depend on the property and where they are on their use restrictions on our LoRa, but potentially not. We have, though, to this point, LISC with Enterprise and CSH, since we're also mission-based financing entities that do LIHTC equity work and work as a CDFI. The message that we put out to our 37 local offices, and we blasted to every national partner here representing a financing entity, was really from that kind of argument as well. Like, not just from the service provider, but we thought it might resonate more with the Republicans on the Hill, to say that, look, if there's debt on this property and you willy-nilly cap operating assistance, the property could go into default for any private lender, mission-based or for-profit, or the investments on those properties are also threatened. And hey, remember, you just passed a partisan tax bill where you did the largest expansion of that program that's often commingled with these properties. And so that was recently included in some of the trade associations here that represent the CRA parts of banks and investors. There is some advocacy out there on that, but I think it would depend on the property. I did want to follow up as well on the previous question. So the cap would apply, as far as we understand it, to rapid rehousing projects, because in the statute they're referred to as permanent housing. So that would mean if you're a COC, then you have this new 30% cap, which would not be enough to fund all your existing supportive housing and rapid rehousing.
And to build on that, are we hearing outside of the White House, is there support for that 30% funding cap in the House and Senate, or do we know yet, or is that still just a executive branch position?
It's mostly an executive branch position. It was included in the president's budget request for HUD and rejected by the House and Senate. The Democrats at the top appropriators, DeLauro in the House and Senator Murray in the Senate, have included language that require HUD to renew all grants for 1 year. And so that's the cleanest solution here. Like, even if the government was open, they wouldn't get it out, money would start lapsing. In our advocacy, we don't reference the members themselves or those sections of a bill because it's partisan. We want to see Republicans buy on, since they're in the majority in the House and Senate. So if we did send some stuff to our local offices, folks are also welcome to ping me. I'll put my email in the chat. And if you want to send some of the messages that we have crafted around from a financing perspective, we welcome it to your local banks, CDFIs, other investment partners. And then as well, the National Alliance to End Homelessness has lots of good advocacy for service providers.
Great, thank you. Yeah, again, our ground game needs to be a huge focus, and we're going to our commitment at LISC is to continue to push out the advocacy messages and toolkits as they come available. So please make sure you're on our email list. Some of you I send targeted things to because specifically of your role or your organization's role, right, in some of these issues and being able to speak to this, but it is really something we all need to double down on. Mark, I want to call out one more question that was in our chat because the whole group can't see it, and I do think it's an important point of conversation, and that's around the proposed rule that HUD regarding non-citizen households that receive support that might have non-citizen household members. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's also really, really important for folks to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Folks may remember the Trump administration tried to do a proposed rule. It's called the Mixed Status Families Rule. Essentially, there's this Section 214 of this law from the 90s says if you have a non-citizen in a household, like in a HUD-assisted property, then you receive prorated assistance. That person is just taken out of the calculation. What they're proposing is that they would change the rule that would say that if there's any non-citizen in the household, then there's no eligibility for any of the household members. So this obviously would jeopardize the housing stability for currently HUD-assisted tenants who'd have to make a very tough choice on whether that family member has to leave or the entire family leaves. It's projected, including by HUD, that most family members would choose to leave together since they're a family. And so this is a big threat for tenant protections. And, you know, I think in the last administration, this proposed rule set a record in HUD's entire history as a department in terms of public comment responses, primarily against it. So we'll need to see good mobilization again to be able to protect these families and make sure that the law is being followed.
Great. Okay, well, it is 11 o'clock. We just blazed through a lot of content, a lot of state and federal updates. We really appreciate everyone for joining us today. I really want to thank Nathan and Mark for bringing their expertise and perspective to this. Again, please stay tuned. Please reach out to us, or if you are visiting with us from a location outside of Cincinnati, we have some of our friends from around the state in other LISC markets. Please work with your LISC, local LISC office to really stay connected and figure out how you can really play a role in this. But we really appreciate both of your time, and thank you all for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Take care, everyone. Thank you.